I'm Alex Colvin, Dean of the Industrial Labor Relations School at Cornell University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on the U.S. gender wage gap, patterns, policy, and the pandemic's impact. I think we're going to have a great discussion today, and there's going to be an opportunity to answer some of your questions. So please do put those in, and we'll look forward to the discussion to come. I want to start by introducing our three wonderful panelists that we have today. First off, Professor Francine Blau, who is the Francis Perkins Professor of Industrial Labor Relations and Professor of Economics here at Cornell University. She is an expert on the issue of gender issues, wage inequality, immigration, international comparisons of labor outcomes. She's the author of Equal Pay in the Office and Gender Inequality in Wages, and with Lawrence Kahn, also faculty member here at ILR, of At Home and Abroad, U.S. Labor Market Performance in International Perspective. Welcome to the panel. Our second panelist is Dr. Erica Groshan, who is Senior Economics Advisor here at Cornell's ILR School. She's also a Research Fellow at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. Prior to joining us from 2013 to 2017, she served as the 14th Commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the principal federal agency responsible for measuring labor market activity, working conditions, and inflation. Really one of those crucial government agencies that often goes unsung, but much of what we know about what's going on in the labor market is really thanks to the hard work and the important role of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So a big shout out to the BLS, which is important work that they do. Her own research is centered on jobless recoveries, wage rigidity and dispersion, and the role of employers in the labor market. Thank you for joining us. And then our third panelist, Eduardo Porter, economics reporter from the New York Times. One of the top economics reporters in the country. He's the author of The Price of Everything, an exploration of the cost-benefit analyses that underpin human behaviors and institutions. We all rely very much on his excellent reporting on economic issues. I was just noticing a couple of days ago, I was reading a story, Employer Practices Limit Worker Choices and Wages, and it turns out that was one of Eduardo's stories. So a real pleasure to have him with us today for today's panel. We're talking today about one of the enduring and really important issues in the labor market. It's something that we have known existed for decades, that there is a gender wage gap. It's according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics data in 2020, women's annual earnings were on average 82% of men's, and that gap was even wider for many women of color. This is a complex, important issue that's been subject to a lot of research, debate, and discussion around the policy options for addressing it. Today, we're going to be talking about what the data is telling us. We'll be talking about what to think about and expect with policymaking. Also, how the pandemic might have shifted the dynamics involved in this disparity. I think in many areas of the world of work, the pandemic has affected things over the last 2 years, and certainly in this area, it's an interesting question what the impact of the pandemic has been. And then we'll also talk about how we think about the implications for the future going forward of work and where this is headed in the years to come. I'm going to start off by asking each of our panelists to make some comments. I'm going to start off with Professor Blau. And I want to ask you a question. You've been studying this area very intensely for an extended period of time. It's a really amazing body of research you've done. But I'm really interested to hear, what have you seen change over time during your research on this topic, and where are you most focused in this area going forward?
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I'm just delighted to be here today and to have the opportunity to talk about this really important topic with you all. Well, one of the really interesting things about the gender pay gap is it's been with us for a long time, but the level of it has changed. So 82 women working full-time year-round, earning 82% of what their male counterparts earn is not necessarily cause for celebration. And it is, rightly a great concern. But back in 1980, women were earning only about 60% of their male counterparts. So I do want to start off by saying that the gap itself has shrunk, and that is a positive development. And some of the reasons for it have changed. If we go back to 1980, two factors that economists in general always focus on as extremely important in explaining pay differentials. These two factors explained a substantial portion of the gap. One was work experience, because at that time, women tended to move in and out of the labor force in response to the needs of their families. And actually, education explained a bit of the gap. At that time, men were more highly educated than women. And so one of the really big changes that has occurred is that those two factors, work experience and education, don't explain very much of the gender pay gap at all anymore. And this reflects two factors. One is that women have gotten much more attached to the labor force. And so back in 1980, on average, women had 7 years less experience than men. And now the gender difference is less than a year and a half. So women have really shrunk that gap. And today, women are actually better educated than men. They're more likely to be college graduates than men are. And actually, this is not just the case in the United States. This female advantage in education is actually true in most advanced economies in the world and many developing countries as well. So that's kind of good news. And actually, the upgrading of qualifications in these two domains is one of the reasons that the gender pay gap has fallen. But there is still a gap, and you may want to talk about what explains it. And there, I think there's a proverb in French: the more things change, the more they stay the same. Some of the factors that were important in 1980 are quite important now. Women tend to work in different occupations than men. And this is a very important factor in explaining the gender pay gap, even though women have made enormous advances in their occupations. They have entered traditionally male managerial jobs, and they've moved into a lot of traditionally male professions like law and medicine. So there have been a lot of gains, but still occupational differences between men and women explain about a third of the gender pay gap. Also, it's much less talked about, but women work in different industries than men on average. They're much more likely to be employed in education and health. Men are more likely to be employed in manufacturing and construction industries. And actually, those industry differences also contribute to the gender pay gap. So about half the gap is due to differences in occupations and industries. But even when you control for, in a statistical analysis, when you control for the factors that you can measure that help to explain the gap between men and women, you find an unexplained difference. It's called an unexplained gap. Now, in a recent analysis that I did with my colleague, Larry Kahn, who you mentioned, we found that explained 38% of the difference. How do we interpret that? Well, it is an indicator of discrimination. It's not a perfect indicator because there may be things that we couldn't measure that are important to employers. But I feel, taking the totality of the evidence, our statistical analyses, and other very interesting studies that sort of experimental studies, that discrimination is still a factor, though I feel that it has declined, that the extent of discrimination against women has declined. And in our research, we found that the size of this unexplained gap has decreased. So let me just mention a couple of other things before turning it over to the other panelists. When we look at the factors that are still important, again, we have these industry and occupation differences. We don't know entirely what caused them. We have discrimination still being a factor. Some very interesting recent research has really highlighted the underlying role of children and the unequal way in which children are cared for and reared in most families, meaning essentially that women tend to have a larger role. And the research suggests that when women have children, they sort of start on a lower career trajectory as a consequence of that. And I think that we're going to be wanting to return to that in our discussion. Another very interesting recent development is that the gender pay gap has shrunk throughout the female labor force, but it's decreased less for women, high-skilled women who are college graduates, women who are at the upper reaches of the earnings distribution. So this is a very interesting and important development, and I think it's one that we're going to want to pay some attention to and talk to. Just briefly, I would mention that it does bring to mind notions of glass ceiling, that this is a group of men that have advanced enormously in terms of earnings in recent years, and clearly women are not keeping pace. And one thing I did want to mention is very interesting work from a Cornell graduate, Claudia Golden, a very distinguished economics professor at Harvard, who calls attention to, in some of these very high-paying areas, particularly in business and law, that there's a lack of flexibility and an implicit requirement to work very long hours. I believe that in major law firms, I could be wrong on this, but they consider 40 hours a week part-time work or something like that. So we're talking hours worked over 50. And this clearly disadvantages women relative to men. And she's raised the issue of whether we might want to consider how work is structured and whether that would be a way to reduce the gap. So let me stop here. I look very much forward to hearing what Erica and Eduardo have to say about this, and maybe having a chance to join in again a bit later.
Yeah, thanks for those remarks, Fred. I was instantly thinking of, during my brief legal practice career before becoming an academic, we did in fact have a part-time partner who worked 40 hours a week, and it was a woman partner in the firm. So that really resonated with me a lot. I'm going to turn to Dr. Groshan next. Erica, what do you see in the data? You've this deep involvement with the data, and particularly, also during the pandemic, what have you seen shifting that might give us a clue about where things are headed?
Well, first of all, let me echo what Professor Blau-Francine had to say about being really happy to join this panel and talk about this issue today. It's quite a topical one, and I think with the pressures that we're feeling on the labor market due to the pandemic and afterwards, it's very important to see what impact it's having on important trends in the labor market, like the male-female wage differential. So I think the first thing that comes to mind to point out is that we are at a time of a lot of churn in the labor market. So we have we sort of had a pent-up demand for job switching that because for 2 years, pretty much no one was searching and no one was changing jobs. And now people can do that. And so this is a time of a lot of churn. We have an unusual amount of people quitting and an unusual amount of job posting, kind of to make up for this being frozen in time for a couple of years. And employers are very cognizant and very vocal about their challenges in finding workers. And this seems to be opening from everything they're saying, although it's hard to track this in the data yet. There's certainly a lot of discussion about employers opening up their hiring and advancement opportunities to groups that were previously excluded. Now, this includes formerly incarcerated folks and folks maybe without degrees, but who are highly skilled. But presumably, to the extent that discrimination is playing a role, then you might think that relaxing traditional hiring patterns that lead to these unequal outcomes would also be relaxed. So I think it's a time of opportunity for women. And so I'm going to go through a lot of first list some kind of positive impacts that I think we could be seeing, and particularly if they're sustained. Now, if, of course, everything goes back to normal in a few years, all bets are off. But I think that employers learn and people learn from these experiences, and so it's positive to see them. We are also seeing wage gains being highest in industries in particular, but also occupations where wages are lowest. And many of those are occupations in industries where women are concentrated. So we just heard about that. Leisure and hospitality has a very heavily female labor force, and the average wages there are pretty much the lowest of the major occupational groups. Retail, trade, home health care. These are areas where we're seeing unusually high wage increases. In fact, in some of these cases, above the rate of inflation. So this means you're getting real gains. Also, when you look at the employment cost index, which allows you to divide it by occupational groups better, and also controls for compositional effects, you see that for the past half year or so, we've had much more variation in occupational wage changes than we've ever seen in the series before. And again, the occupations that are seeing the highest gains are among lowest paid and heavily female. So those are good signs. Those would narrow the gap. We're also seeing improved work-life balance policies, flexibility obviously about where you work, but also family and sick leaves, less travel, which is disruptive to people who are have family responsibilities, more focus on making sure that that homes have good connectivity, and that's very much in the policy tool basket that's being discussed. So there's a lot of focus on improving work-life balance for everyone, but I think this could lead to a narrowing of the wage gap for the reasons that we just heard about. That the more all jobs are friendly towards family care responsibilities, this opens up more employment options for women with children in particular. It evens the playing field within the household on the allocation of responsibilities. If everybody has some flexibility, it doesn't have to be focused on the one person who maybe made a trade-off to get that flexibility, and would also go along the lines of promoting more continuous career paths. And that's narrowed a lot, but there's still a discrepancy between men and women and what have that. Another interesting factor is that there's an increased interest and activity in union representation, and in many cases in industries that are more heavily female. But even what's important there is that unionized workplaces tend to have much lower wage differences between men and women. They have smaller wage disparities in total, and certainly between men and women as well. And then the maybe the last thing I'll mention on the positive side is that there's been a recognition of the importance of access to high quality childcare as a labor market issue. And so this, I think it sort of raised the consciousness of employers and policymakers on how important this is to labor market. Now, on the negative side, there are some challenges that, if sustained, could push in the other direction. There's an irony that when you improve the quality and the safety of childcare and elder care and improve the wages of those workers, you're going to make it harder for people to afford that. And that could cause family members to withdraw from the labor force. And so that could depress labor force participation among women. And then the pandemic has certainly led us to question what we've seen, that schools and childcare and elder care have become less reliable in a pandemic situation. And so you could imagine people no longer assuming that schools, childcare, elder care are going to be there when they need it, and they might just opt to not to work at all, or to work less than they did before. So those are the things that I've heard a lot about and have been seeing. I think most of them push in the direction of this beneficial for in the long run in terms of narrowing the wage gap. And it'll be interesting to see. Oh, actually, there's one more thing I wanted to mention, which is I just heard about a paper today, just this morning, that looks at what people do when they, how their time expenditures changes, their time use changes when they work from home. And this study by Victoria Vernon and Sabrina Papalonia, one of whom is Sabrina Papalonia is at the BLS, finds that when working from home, full-time wage and salary workers save 75 minutes by reducing time from commuting and grooming activities. Fathers spend more time on childcare, and women spend time sleeping and on housework. Couples spend more time together. So we have an idea of what happens with people. All right, let me stop there and let you continue.
Thanks. That was fascinating comments. The areas where we're doing less of, probably things we should be doing more of, is a real interesting indicator there. That both in terms of male and female behavior. I'm going to turn to Eduardo Porter now. Eduardo, you do a lot of reporting in this economic and work kind of space. What are your takeaways from all of this, from your reporting?
Thanks, Alex. Well, first of all, again, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. In fact, I feel a little daunted. I'm just a reporter. I am not an expert. And so listening to Professor Blau and Professor Groshan, it does give me a little bit of pause. But I can share a little bit of what I've read and seen in the literature, and what kind of questions that has sparked in me that kind of track with the observation we've just heard. Now, I went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and to look at what data we might have of how the pandemic affected the gender wage gap, and there's the pattern that Francine and Erica were talking about shows up very clearly. The wage gap, the gender wage gap for workers without a high school degree or with just a high school certificate actually closed pretty sharply between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the fourth quarter of 2021, according to the BLS data that I was looking at. But for women with a bachelor's degree or more, the gap did not close at all. It remained pretty much flat, the same as it was at the end of 2019. And so this effect of the pandemic on the relative wages of men and women seems to have been very kind of sharp amongst less educated, lower wage jobs and occupations than it was amongst higher, more educated men and women. And now, all the reasons that Erica was talking about make a ton of sense to me. And the one thing that gives me pause when hearing of all the things that could be pushing us into a better place is that I'm not really convinced that we can see out there kind of like permanent shifts in the way businesses go about employing, in the way the American economy works. We got an enormous jolt from COVID, which, kind of like threw everything in the air and has led to these enormous changes in the workplace that we're still seeing through. But I wouldn't be surprised if this eventually washes out and we're left roughly in the same sort of place that we were before COVID hit. And so some of these factors that seem to be sort of like improving the wage of women relative to men at the bottom of the pay scale, might not persist. I mean, there could be a chance that, policy changes get stuck. Like, for instance, if there is a permanent child credit that would help women to join the workforce and have more hours in the workforce and take a wider variety of jobs, that could ultimately be helpful. Maybe work from home, as Erica mentioned at the end, could also lead to some more permanent change. But other than that, I'm really not sure that these shifts that we're experiencing now really tell us that much about how it's going to be over the long term. But the thing that I think that the broader question here that kind of like brings us is more about the longer. It's the question that Francine started with. How come we got stuck? The gender pay gap has closed pretty dramatically since the 1960s. And our understanding of what drives wages and what drives earnings has also leads us to believe that the gap should even close further, and yet it has not. So, the conventional understanding of how the American job market works, would suggest, in fact, that the pay gap would be the other way around, because economists keep telling us that the way to get ahead in the labor market is to invest in what they call human capital. By that measure, women, are way ahead of the game. They surpassed men in educational attainment years ago. And so, again, if you look back through from to the 1960s and the move into the present, you can see a story where the increasing educational attainment of women is accompanied by a closing wage gap, and women more and more joining the labor force in occupations that used to be just taken by men. There's a really cool paper that I like by four guys, and they are guys: Chang Tai-Hsieh, Eric Hurst, Jones, and Klenow, who found that in 1960, 94% of doctors and lawyers were white men. And by 2008, the figure was only 62%. So, it's a story that we kind of like know anecdotally. It's a story of Sandra Day O'Connor graduating third from her class from Stanford in 52, and the only job she can get in the private sector is a legal secretary. Now, these guys, Hsieh, Hurst et al., they calculated that the erosion of the barriers of women and people of color into occupations from which they had been excluded actually raised the wages of white women by 40%, of Black women by 60% from 1960 to 2008. And they also, of course, raised the wages of Black men who had also been excluded, but they cut the wages of white men by 5%. And they find that this pretty much explains all the narrowing of the wage gap, all the narrowing of the gender wage gap since 1960. And it accounts for about 3/4 of the increase in women's labor supply. So this is really pretty remarkable progress. And the question that it leaves us is, well, why did the progress, get stuck? And the story, I think, that that Francine was alluding to before, that Claudia Golden has worked on, is I find quite compelling. That a lot of this is about selection. Women and men making different choices, not only in the job market, but even before that, the major that they follow in college. And the fact that this might have to do with mothers having a much higher homework burden because they're in charge of most childcare, is also sort of like a compelling reason. The women selecting jobs that allow for more flexible schedules ends up with women leaving money on the table. They forego careers in law and finance, where the money is good, even though the hours are grueling, and they take jobs with more predictable time at home. This shows up in, women doctors gravitating towards specialties like pediatrics, where the hours are more predictable, and fewer of them going into things like neurosurgery. There's an interesting paper that Golden did with co-author Larry Katz, that what suggested that amongst the best educated women and men, the pay gap straight out of college was actually quite small, but in fact got bigger over time, kind of suggesting that the childcare burden was growing over the course of women's careers and could be, explain a substantial amount of the gap. Other work by Professor Golden has also found that the pay gap is smaller in occupations that allow for more flexible hours, like, phlebotomy or pharmacy. And so, for sure, I think that one has to keep in mind that discrimination is persistent. And there is actually, I did a recent story about a paper that just looked at directly for evidence of discrimination in the labor force, and it's clearly still there. But nonetheless, we are still left with the question of where do we most effectively address the gender wage gap, given these differences that occur before the labor market, that occur in the household. To ask the policy question, what is the space for policies focused on promoting more equitable workloads at home? Could that play a substantial role in reducing the wage gap that we have that remains? And to this point, I wanted to refer to a paper that Francine and Larry Kahn did maybe a decade ago that I thought was really amazingly interesting. They were looking at the labor supply, the labor force participation of women across a bunch of countries in the OECD, a bunch of industrialized countries. And they found that from 1990 to 2010, the LFP in the United States, the women's labor force participation in the United States was in 6th place amongst this selection of industrialized countries. And over the course of their study from 1990 to 2010, it fell to 17th place. And the kind of like the first order thought, the first order argument was all these other OECD countries had much more generous policies to support women working. They had, more generous leave policies that allowed women to leave the labor force if they needed to deal with childcare and then return. There was more generous childcare from the state that would also help women work instead of having to stay at home. And so this made a lot of sense, but this came also with a twist in that the paper suggested that even though, the labor supply of women in all these other countries had become higher than the US, they had surpassed the US in labor supply, it was still true that in the United States, women took kind of like the more ambitious jobs. They were on the jobs that women took in the United States were on, say, a higher career trajectory than women workers in all these other countries. And that sort of suggested that, okay, even if you make these policies to ease the, say, home work balance for mothers, this might lead employers to perhaps, hire fewer women because they're going to have to pay them for more generous leave, or something that was, even as it was helping women enter the workforce, seemed to be blunting their kind of like their career paths. And so anyway, that kind of like leaves you with a conundrum. Okay, is the policy to, improve, help women deal with the burdens at home, and so in order that they can increase their labor supply, they can work more hours and less flexible jobs? Or is there something else that can be done? And anyway, I just wanted to leave with a final thought, finish with a final thought, which is, a lot of this, the debate, the arguments over the gender pay gap tend to be framed around the notion of justice, which I think is perfectly reasonable and fine and good. But I also think that we might overlook another argument, which is the kind of like the cost to society at large. How much are we foregoing for having women be pay less in lower trajectory occupations, with more obstacles to join the labor force in full? I mean, you can think about this in dollars and cents. An economy in which a bunch of less educated, less productive men are holding jobs that could be held by better educated, more productive women is likely to be poorer than it could be. And so I think that it's kind of important also to understand this in terms of this as a cost to society. It's not just a matter of justice, but, in a way, a matter of efficiency as well. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. I hope to learn more from Erica and Francine over the next few minutes. And thanks much.
Great. Thanks, Eduardo. Really interesting. I was going to, you've chucked out some interesting kind of questions there. So I do want to give Francine and Erica a chance to pick up on that, particularly around, ways to close the disparities, what the policy options are. Francine, do you want to have a go first?
Yeah, I would like to. And, I did find all the preceding remarks fascinating. I'd like to dig in a little bit more on the two alternatives, I think, that Eduardo highlighted. One is what we economists tend to call the supply side, the choices that men and women make, the qualifications they have, and the other is the demand side, discrimination. And I think he was very careful in what he said, but I would like to emphasize that both do play a role, and they can't always be neatly compartmentalized. So why do women take a larger role in the family? Well, it's probably, millennia or century or whatever, centuries of tradition and other factors. But it is also true when there is a pay gap, the opportunity cost to women taking a larger role is smaller than the opportunity cost to men. So inequities in the labor market, even relatively small ones early in the career, can reinforce the traditional division of labor. So I wanted to make that point. Now, within the family-friendly area, and it was interesting to hear Eduardo mention this study that Larry and I did. It was a very good summary. But I think that one of the potential problems with work-family policies, not that I'm at all against them, is they can mommy track women. They can almost encourage a weaker attachment to the labor force, potentially staying out of the labor force longer. Even an individual woman, they might say, wouldn't you like to work part-time? I mean, channeling women in that way. And then also from the employer's perspective, if there's a very long parental leave disproportionately taken by women, do you want to put that woman in a fast-track position where her leaving for an extended period of time is going to be a problem? So I think that especially when we look at parental leave, it's not necessarily the case that more is better. There's some optimal amount. And when I have talked to the press about it, they said, how much? And I said, I don't know. But I would say in these other countries that we were comparing the US to, parental leave was on average about a year. Now that is a long time to potentially have an employer have to find substitutes or whatever. On the other hand, in the United States, and the leave in other countries is all paid at some rate. In the United States, we have 12 weeks of unpaid leave. I mean, that's a huge difference. And we could still have too little in the US, but maybe they have too much in terms of emphasizing equity within the labor market. And then I did want to say a word about discrimination. The US was actually the first country among economically advanced nations to pass legislation to ban discrimination. And our legislation is very impressive in a lot of ways. I would say the enforcement of it has waxed and waned depending on who was in the White House. But we do have impressive laws that need to be enforced. But there are some interesting new initiatives that I just want to put out on the table there. One is pay transparency, which has been effective in other countries. And that, at minimum, would entail guaranteeing the right of employees to find out what the wages of their coworkers are, which is not possible in many firms today. So they potentially know that they have a complaint or even a lawsuit. And the other is to think about actually publicizing the pay gap by industry, maybe even by firm. This has been done in some other countries, which might put some, not to say that every gap is an indication at all of discrimination, but it might put some normative pressure on. And the others that's very interesting, and we've got at least one state that has done this, is salary history bans. So when you hire a new worker as an employer, one of the first things you do is say, well, we're really interested in you. What are you currently making? And you give something over that. And that sort of, if there's inequity and discrimination before, it sort of passes it on to the new job. So there's been some momentum to banning that question, which could be quite interesting. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for those comments. Yeah, I think this, the issue of the policy responses and around the questions of pay transparency, salary history bans, really are something that's caught a lot of attention. It's interesting. We've had a couple of questions in the from the audience about exactly that issue. So I think people are thinking about a lot of things like Glassdoor. I think have really encouraged people to think about that. The site that allows people to sort of report on their own salaries and is very heavily used now. I think by a lot of job seekers. Erica, can I turn to you maybe just to follow up on Francine's comments and these kind of questions around the policy responses and how we think about their potential impact?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with the kinds of things that Francine mentioned last, which are very much focused on the discrimination part of it, and I think are important. So I had those on my list. I'll mention one more that I referred to before, which is having a voice for workers and the transparency and the negotiating ability within firms that comes with collective bargaining, or potentially workers and works councils could, if we had those there, could provide that kind of voice. So in the U.S. context, it's really only collective bargaining that provides this, and that can make a difference. So policies that recognize that as another benefit of collective bargaining, I think, would push in this direction. And then going back to the question of childcare, there's a little bit of a funny thing about this flexibility, in that it is with all of these worker job characteristics, right, with benefits, et cetera, that we have. There's this thought generally that there should be compensating differentials in wages for characteristics that people value. And when we do studies, it can be very difficult to identify the actual trade-off between these characteristics and wages. And so and I think that part of the problem is that, and I haven't seen a study that actually does this, but if we think about it, there's one of the problems with measuring these is that there's a scale effect and the substitution effect. So if people are earning not very much at all, then usually they get lousy wages and lousy working conditions. Whereas at the upper end, you're maybe more likely to see that trade-off. And I think the reason that it's relevant to this is that the lowest wage workers very often have the worst working conditions in terms of flexibility. They, especially with the advent of some of the algorithmic scheduling mechanisms, they have very little control over when they're going to be asked to work, and that makes it very difficult for them. And so I think we're getting it's a confounding influence on understanding what's going on, and and it makes it all the more important to think about how workers in those situations can be supported, either by placing some limitations on the ability of employers to impose these kinds of unexpected scheduling requirements, and or the kind of support for the particularly low wage workers needs for child care, elder care, et cetera. So universal pre-K, child tax credits, child care subsidies are important. Maybe universal long-term care insurance would be important as well. So some of these policies that we think of as primarily aimed at low-wage workers may also be beneficial to narrowing the gap. Going to work so much at the upper end, but I think that they're important. Last thing I'm going to mention is that these conversations take place in the context. I mean, the reason we're comfortable talking about what we've seen and we have a result to talk about is because we have official statistics out there that have broad samples and are based on known statistical techniques, trusted. And we really need these to guide private decisions in public policy. And if we want to know more about where the problems are, then we probably need to invest more in our official statistics, because there are some questions that we just can't answer with the kind of data that we have now. And there are opportunities out there to tap into administrative data that there are laws that prevent the statistical agencies from being able to conduct. So, for instance, the federal BLS does not have access to states' unemployment insurance wage records, nor is there a mechanism right now at the federal level to enhance those records by adding the demographic information that you would need to really understand these patterns. And so if we're serious about this and we want to go forward, we need to be collecting the kind of data that will really inform policy in its design and in its evaluation afterwards.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'll second that call for the better data collection and putting our resources into that. I want to make sure we get to some of the interesting questions that have been popping up from the audience members. One that's an interesting one I'm going to put out to the panel sort of picks up, I think, a little bit on the parts of the discussion about the role of childcare responsibilities and differential gender roles there and how that impacts the gender wage gap. And the questions asked an interesting one about how you think the wage gap could potentially change in the future with the trend of younger generations not wanting to have children. Not to say that younger generations are not wanting to have children, but you certainly hear these anecdotal reports of, people saying, with climate change and worries about that, wanting to have fewer children. We know, there's been variation over time in sort of family size and across countries in numbers of children. And I don't know if there's any kind of research on, how that interacts with the gender wage gap. But, I think the question is, do we see any changes with the trends in terms of numbers of children and how that interacts with the wage gap? Anybody like to have a go at Fran? You want to give a go on that one? Yeah.
Good question. When someone says that, there's not necessarily going to be an answer, but there's a lot going on with fertility, and the U.S. was actually had one of the higher fertility rates of the economically advanced countries. A number of countries have gotten extremely low. Japan, ironically, a number of the places like Italy that you don't think of, you think of as more traditional, perhaps. And just recently, the U.S. Fertility rate has started to fall. It began to fall. So we were high in the sense that our fertility was around the replacement level, which is not enormous. But after the Great Recession, our fertility rate started to fall as well. And I think the questioner has hit on a point. No, it hasn't right away had an impact on the gender pay gap in a number of these countries where fertility has fallen to very, very low levels. So maybe we just have to observe it over a longer period of time. To see. So, can I just make a really quick point that
absolutely.
I just wanted to really second what Erica said about a lot of things, of course, but childcare, because when I was talking about potential trade-offs of family-friendly policy versus how well women do in the labor market in other respects, it was really centered on parental leave. There's no trade-off with childcare assistance. That's kind of win-win from the perspective of making it easier to combine work and family. And also, that's our next generation. Their well-being, just as I really like the point that Eduardo made about essentially we leave money on the table by not not encouraging or enabling women to reach their full potential. Similarly, by not ensuring adequate care for all children, we're jeopardizing our future.
Yeah, Eduardo, did you have want to jump into the comment?
On the relationship between fertility and the gender wage gap? A story that I've heard. I mean, I've heard two stories. Like over the long sweep of time in the United States, there is a very clear relationship between a declining number of children and more women joining the workforce, getting education, and the pay gap closing. So I think that at the very basic kind of like course level, there's a positive relationship. But your point about these countries that have very, very low fertility rates, like Spain, Italy, Japan, the fact, a story that I've heard about why, in fact, in these countries, the pay gap and, in fact, some of the differences in the discrimination in the labor market is often way more intense than it is in the United States. Kind of like puts the causation the other way around. It's like in these countries where women are not allowed or have it very, very difficult timing being both mothers and workers, they are choosing to be workers instead of mothers. I mean, this is something that I've heard in the case of Spain, for instance. In the case of Japan, I'm not sure. I don't think that would be particular. I don't think that's a very good explanation because women still have a lot of challenges to join the workplace, especially after they get married. I mean, women that join the workplace before marriage, then they tend to leave it when they get married. But I think it might move the other way. The difficulty of balancing these two things out can lead to, outcomes in the labor market, a lot of labor market discrimination, but it can also lead to lower fertility.
Another question that jumped out to me relates to something we've all discussed at different points, and this question of occupational differences and industry differences. And the question actually relates to the situation of women going into more stereotypically male jobs, and the question of any comments, thoughts on the need that women face to be more aggressive in the workplace to get those same jobs and wages that are, traditionally male, and then resulting in the stereotype of being a mean, rude, bossy boss, which puts me in mind of the famous Pricewaterhouse and Hopkins discrimination case in the Supreme Court, which was exactly this issue of a woman advancing to be a partner, but was considered to be too mean, bossy, and aggressive for this job, which is exactly the description, I think, of 99.9% of the males in that job. But the issue of gender stereotyping there. I remember learning about that in law school. It was the late 1980s kind of case. But any thoughts on that issue of how occupational segregation and job segregation kind of plays out as we try and address that? Erica, do you want to have a go first?
Yeah, it's not so much an evaluation of how women are treated generally, but what is interesting and jumps out at you at the data is that even when you have more entrance of women into an occupation, they very often tend to work in particular companies or particular parts of that occupation that become heavily female, and those are less paid than men's. So some of it may well be, you could tell a story that this is just evading the law that said men and women have to be paid the same if they're working together. So then you just separate them, right? You define occupation a little differently, or you have a company that specializes basically in hiring women. I remember, Alan Greenspan saying, well, of course I mostly had women economists working for me because they were such a good bargain. Which in some ways made him look admirable, and in other ways made him look like he was taking care, he was taking advantage of this wage difference. But anyway, so the entrance, so in addition to maybe not being treated equally when they do work together, we have patterns, policies, whatever, that still tend to keep them separate with a wage implication for that.
Yeah, thanks. Fran, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just a quick one. I agree with that. Professional women walk a tightrope, or maybe women in all areas kind of walk a tightrope. And I think we can attest to that personally, and we can attest to it in terms of the literature. Yes, women should negotiate more to increase their salaries. Yes, there's a negative response, or women being too pushy, and negotiating. The same behavior of a woman very often elicits a woman doing exactly what a man would do, elicits a negative a response. And there's even a psychological trait called agreeableness. And actually in the workplace, disagreeableness has a positive pay premium for men, but not for women. So, I very much sympathize with this, and it is a challenge that women have to face.
Yeah, and I do research on conflict resolution is sort of a well-known finding in the negotiations literature that you see differential kind of negotiation behavior between men and women. And, there's some idea that this is part of this sort of social acceptability. There's a greater sort of social acceptability of males being aggressive bargainers for exactly the reasons you're saying. When I would teach that, I always kind of, try to remember to point out that, any negotiation, there's two sides to the negotiation. And so if it's the case that the male supervisor is negotiating the higher wages for the male candidates, but not with the female candidates, that's the responsibility of the supervisor and ultimately the employer as well. That's not the sort of individual woman's responsibility to correct the gender wage gap just by being a better negotiator. That's actually an employer responsibility as well, and arguably a broader societal responsibility as well, which I think is suggested by some of these laws around pay gaps and salary history in negotiations. Unfortunately, we are running up to the end of our time, and I think the vigor of this conversation, I think, is a reflection of the importance of this issue, the complexity of it, and the ongoing nature of this problem. We obviously haven't solved it here in the 1 hour discussion, but I also think as a society, we clearly have not solved this issue. It's something that continues to be really important to be addressed and researched and thought about going forward. I do want to finish just by thanking our three amazing panelists, Professor Francine Blau, Dr. Erica Groshan, and Eduardo Porter. Thank you all for your great comments, and really appreciate the discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.